Hi, guys. Invitation to the White House. The President of the United States will now address you, announced the loudspeaker voice in the lobby of the Space Hotel. Grandma Georgina's head peeped cautiously out from under the sheets. Grandma Josephine took her fingers out of her ears, and Grandpa George lifted his face out of the pillow. You mean he's actually going to speak to us? Whispered Charlie. Shh, said Mr. Wonka. Listen. Dear friends, said the well-known presidential voice over the loudspeaker. Dear friends, welcome to Space Hotel, USA. Greetings to the brave astronauts from Mars and Venus. Mars and Venus, whispered Charlie. You mean he thinks we're from... Shh, said Mr. Wonka. He was doubled up with silent laughter, shaking all over and hopping from one foot to the other. You have come a long way, the president continued, so why don't you come just a tiny bit further and pay us a visit down here on our humble little Earth. I invite all 8 of you to stay with me here in Washington as my honored guests. You could land that wonderful glass air machine of yours on the lawn in the back of the White House. We shall have the red carpet out and ready. I do hope you know enough of our language to understand me. I shall wait most anxiously for your reply. There was a click, and the president went off the air. What a fantastic thing, whispered Grandpa Joe. The White House, Charlie. We're invited to the White House as honored guests. Charlie caught hold of Grandpa Joe's hand, and the two of them started dancing around and round. The lobby of the hotel, Mr. Wonka, still shaking with laughter, went and sat down on the bed and signaled everyone to gather round close so they could whisper without being heard by the hidden microphones. They're scared to death, he whispered. They won't bother us anymore now. So let's have that feast we're talking about, and afterwards we can explore the hotel. Aren't we going to the White House? Whispered Grandma Josephine. I want to go to the White House and stay with the president. My dear old Dottie Dumpling, said Mr. Wonka, you look as much like a man from Mars as a bedbug. They'd know at once that they'd been fooled. We'd be arrested before we could say, how do you do? Mr. Wonka was right. There could be no question of accepting the president's invitation, and they all knew it. But we've got to say something to him, Charlie whispered. He must be sitting down there in the White House this very minute waiting for an answer. Make an excuse, said Mr. Bucket. Tell him we're otherwise engaged, said Mrs. Bucket. You are right, whispered Mr. Wonka. It is rude to ignore an invitation. He stood up, walked a few paces from the group. For a moment or two he remained quite still, gathering his thoughts. Then, once again, Charlie saw those tiny, twinkling, smiling wrinkles around the corner of his eyes. And when he began to speak, his voice this time was like the voice of a giant, deep and devilish, very loud and very slow. There he is dancing. He's going to go talk to the president. In the Quelchy Quaggy Swagmire, in the Mashy Midius Harshland, at the witchy hour of gloomness, all the grobes come oozing home. You can hear them softly sliming, glissing, hissing o'er the slubber, all those oily, boily bodies oozing onward in the gloom. So start to run, oh skid and daddle, through the slutter and the slush and the sossel. Skip, jump, hop, and try to scattle. All the grobes are on the roam. In his study, 240 miles below, the president turned white as the White House. Jumping jackrabbits, he cried. I think they're after us. Oh, please let me blow them up, said ex-chief of the army. Silence, said Miss Tibbs. Go stand in the corner. In the lobby of the Space Hotel, Mr. Wonka had merely paused in order to think up another verse, and he was just about to start off again when a frightful, piercing scream stopped him cold. The screamer was Grandma Josephine. She was sitting up in bed and pointing with a shaking finger at the lifts at the far end of the lobby. She screamed a second time, still pointing, and all eyes turned towards the lifts. The door of the one on the left was sliding slowly open, and the watchers could clearly see that there was something thick, something brown, something not exactly brown, but greenish brown, something with slimy skin and large eyes, squatting inside the lift. That was chapter 6. This is chapter 7. And there's that thing that Grandma Josephine saw. Grandma Josephine had stopped screaming now. She had gone rigid with shock. The rest of the group by the bed, including Charlie and Grandpa Joe, had become as still as stone. They dared not move, they dared hardly breathe, and Mr. Wonka, who had swung quickly around to look when the first scream came, was as dumbstruck as the rest. He stood motionless, gaping at the thing in the lift, his mouth slightly open, his eyes stretched wide as two wheels. When he saw what they all saw, was this. It looked more than anything like an enormous egg balanced on its pointed end. It was as tall as a big boy and whiter than the fattest man. The greenish-brown skin had a shiny, wettish appearance, and there were wrinkles in it, about 3/4 of the way up in the whitest part. There were two large round eyes, as big as teacups. The eyes were white, but each had a brilliant red pupil in the center. The red pupils were resting on Mr. Wonka. But now they began traveling slowly across to Charlie and Grandpa Joe, and the others by the bed. Settling upon them and gazing at them with cold, malevolent stare, the eyes were everything. There were no other features, no nose, no mouth, no ears. The entire egg-shaped body was itself moving very, very slightly, pulsing and bulging gently here and there, as though the skin were filled with some kind of thick fluid. At this point, Charlie suddenly noticed that the next lift was coming down. The indicator numbers above the door were flashing. 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, L for lobby. There was a slight pause. The door slid open, and there inside the second lift was another enormous, slimy, wrinkled, greenish-brown egg with eyes. Now the numbers were flashing above all three of the remaining lifts. Down they came, down, 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 and soon at precisely the same time, they reached the lobby floor and the door slid open. 5 doors now, 1 creature in each, 5 in all, and 5 pairs of eyes with brilliant red centers, all watching Mr. Wonka and watching Charlie and Grandpa Joe and the others. There were slight differences in sizes and shape between the 5, but all had the same greenish-brown, wrinkled skin, and the skin was rippling and pulsing. For about 30 seconds, nothing happened. Nobody stirred, nobody made a sound. The silence was terrible. So was the suspense. Charlie was so frightened he felt himself shrinking inside his skin. Then he saw the creature in the left-hand lift suddenly starting to change shape. Its body was slowly becoming longer and longer and thinner, going up and up towards the roof of the lift, not straight up, but curving a little to the left, making a snake-like curve that was curiously graceful. Up to the left, then curling over the top to the right, and coming down again in a half circle. And then the bottom end began to grow out as well, like a tail, creeping along the floor to the left, until at last the creature, which had originally looked like a huge egg, now looked like a long, curvy serpent standing up on its tail. Then the one in the next lift began stretching itself in much the same way, and what a weird and cozy thing it was to watch. It was twisting itself into a shape that was a bit different from the first, balancing itself almost, but not quite, on the tip of its tail. Then the 3 remaining creatures began to stretch themselves all at the same time, each one elongating itself slowly upward, growing taller and taller, thinner and thinner, curving and twisting, stretching and stretching, curling and bending, balancing either on the tail of the head or both, and turned sideways now so that only one eye was visible. When they had all stopped stretching and bending, this was how they finished up. Scram! Scram! Shouted Mr. Wonka. Get out quick! People have never moved faster than Grandpa Joe and Charlie and Mr. and Mrs. Bucket at that moment. They all got behind the bed and started pushing like crazy. Mr. Wonka ran in front of them shouting, "Scram! Scram! Scram!" And in 10 seconds flat, all of them were out of the lobby and back inside the great glass elevator. Frantically, Mr. Wonka began undoing bolts and pressing buttons. The door of the great glass elevator snapped shut and the whole thing leaped sideways. They were away, and of course, all of them, including the 3 old ones in the bed, floated up again into the air. And that is the end of Chapter 7. So they visited the Space Hotel, but they had to leave because of them silly little creatures that they found in there. Draw me out a picture, write me out something to go with it if you can, and we will discuss this in a little bit. See you later. Wash your hands. Be safe.